I also teach at the Department of English and Comparative Literature, and I will be your moderator for today. To formally kick off our event, may I invite Dr. 𝗩𝗀𝗀 to start with our opening remarks.
Magandang hapon sa lahat, sa mga audience na nasa loob ng studio at ang mga fans nanonood sa live stream. Magandang hapon. Natatandaan ko itong project na ito, nagsimula mga a year ago na ipinitch ni Tilde Acuña kung pwede sana raw masama sa, ang gusto niya sana ay yung Writers Forum, pero sabi ko may ibang format yon. Pero katulad na format, sabi ko ito na lamang pan, at sabi naman niya ay okay, no. Nung una siya lamang, pero bandang early this year ay nagkaroon ng pagbabago na kasi yung Penguin Random House Southeast Asia ay nilawakan yung choices ng libro, no. Marami, siguro mga 5, no. Tapos at swak naman sa mission ng ICW na promotion ng libro, ng authors at pagpapalawak ng audience ng mga magagandang libro. Kaya yung 5 na yon ay na-trim down sa 3 at itong pakikinggan nating mga authors na mga kaibigan ko rin, no, mula kay Chris hanggang kay Tilde. At siyempre si Maryanne Moll na kaibigan ko sa Facebook, ay natutuwa ako na magkakasama sila dito para magta-time travel tayo, no? Hindi naman sa time machine kundi sa pamamagitan ng mga imahinasyon at ng mga istorya nilang magaganda, no? Meron tayong 3 author at dahil dun sa anthology mas marami pa. Kaya ngayong hapon ay maswerte tayo na pakinggan, samahan tayo na pumasok sa kanilang temporality at mga narrative. So, magandang hapon at mag-enjoy tayo sa episode na ito ng PAN ng UP-ICW. Magandang hapon.
Thank you so much for that. Is Miss Almira here to... No. Okay. Unfortunately, Miss Almira is not here. So again, thank you very much for that, Dr. 𝗩𝗀𝗀. What a great way to open the event. So thank you as well for Penguin and ICW for organizing this kind of discussion, which really allows us to talk about the really interesting intersections of these different texts. And thank you as well to you, our audience, both of whether you're joining us in person or online, for joining us today, right? So the three books that we have for you here today take us on a journey across time, set in places that are both familiar and strange, and set in places that are in the deep past and sometimes in the not so far future. All of these texts are deeply cognizant of the many ways the past, present, and future are very much intertwined. And these stories remind us that sometimes looking forward necessitates looking back, and that sometimes in looking back, we may find new ways to move forward as well. So I am very excited to hear the authors speak and respond to each other, and it is my pleasure to introduce the authors of The Maps of Camarines, Destination C 2050 AD, and The Crying Mountain. The Maps of Camarines was written by Maryanne Moll. Maryanne Moll has written 3 books. Her first book, Awakenings, and her second book, Little Freedoms, are both collections of essays. Her third book, Married Women, is a short story collection, and the book was a finalist for the 𝗍𝗶𝗶𝗃 Prize for Best Book of Short Fiction in English in 2014. Her short story, At Merienda, won 3rd prize in the 2005 Don Carlos Palanca Memorial Awards for Literature. Her short stories have also been included in anthologies which include Philippine Speculative Fiction 4, Philippine Genre Story Special Crime Edition, and Anomalous 30. She was a fellow for the National Writers Workshop in the University of Santo Tomas, Dumaguete, and the University of the Philippines. Before writing fiction, she was a reporter and columnist for Bicol Daily, and also worked as a disc jockey and newscaster for an FM radio station in Naga City, Camarines Sur. She has created and managed some publications for the Philippine National Police. More recently, she has worked as a publications specialist for a government-owned and controlled corporation for more than 10 years. She has earned units for the degree of Master of Arts in Creative Writing at the University of the Philippines, Diliman, before transferring to a different degree program. She is currently working on her thesis for a Master of Arts in Comparative Literature, major in Literary Theory at UP Diliman. Next, we have Tilde Acuña, the co-editor of Destination C, 2050 AD, and the author of 𝗩𝗶𝘀𝗶𝘶. He teaches at the Department of Filipino and Philippine Literature in the University of the Philippines, Diliman. He is also the illustrator for Marlon Haca's Melismas and a co-editor of Uligat, Best Contemporary Stories in Translation from the Philippines, and several other upcoming anthologies. Finally, we have The Crying Mountain by Criselda Yabes. Criselda Yabes has published 8 books, including Serena's Story, The Loss of a Kingdom, which also won the UP Centennial Literary Prize for Creative Nonfiction, simultaneously with Below the Crying Mountain. A journalism graduate of the University of the Philippines in Diliman, she worked as a correspondent for the International Press in Manila, covering politics and coups as well as other major events overseas. So without further ado, I hand the floor to Maryanne Moll to begin our discussions.
Okay na. Hello. Is the mic on? Thank you. Thank you, Sydney. Good afternoon. Thank you for deciding to make me a part of this event to talk about novels that are gateways to the past, the present, and the future. The book is an English language novel which begins in 1957 and ends in 1959. It is about the beginning of the fall of 3 powerful families in a place that is loosely based on the old Ambos Camarines. It tells the story of the Argüelleses, the Visbales, and the Monsantillos and their eventual downfall. These 3 families are members of powerful, wealthy haciendero clans that have stood uncontested in Camarines. But like all systems of power, sins are committed, and these sins are gathered over generations and continue to plague Philippine society today with consequences. The novel actually went through the workshop circuit. The first 6,000 words of the novel went through the 60th University of the Philippines National Writers' Workshop. I was accepted as a fellow for the novel in English in August 2021. The sessions were live streamed on Facebook, and the session discussing this novel is still available online. The Writers' Workshop has been hosted by 𝗩𝗏𝗀𝗃 for many years, so being a part of this event today is like coming full circle, because now the manuscript discussed before is already a published novel available worldwide. I am now contributing to the airing of our dirty national laundry into the world. Because I'm trained by UP both in creative writing and in critical theory, of course the novel has more than one layer. It cannot have just one layer. I will be defying my UP education if my novel has only one layer. My most basic idea for even writing the story in the first place was this. What if I could write a novel about a young girl who has completely misunderstood what maps were for? And because she was so young and imaginative, she invested maps with some kind of magical clairvoyant powers. And in the novel, that would be undecided. It could have been true, it could have been not true. What if I could write a novel like that? So that's what I started it. However, eventually, the maps became just the foreshadowing of the full story. Because in my mind, and because of UP, when maps are involved, it also involves ownership of land. And in the Philippines, when ownership of land is involved, there is always the matter of an ethical owning of land. I, as the writer, cannot divorce myself from my social consciousness. That's how effective UP has been in educating me. On the surface, the novel is a family story that begins with a little girl that completely misunderstood what maps were for. But underneath that, it is also a commentary on the oppressive system of feudal land owning in the country, rooted in the class war that is a remnant of the Spanish colonial period, which the American colonial period did not really address. the social and economic classes, and the questionable method of acquiring and owning land still exists today, but it is cleverly disguised as something else. We cannot prove it, that's how cleverly it's being done. But in our hearts and in our minds, because we think about these things, we know that the problem continues to exist. The supernatural figures significantly in the story, as many of the elements of our colonial past remain unresolved to this day and can more effectively be told using the language and symbols of ghosts, specters, and phantoms. The haunting of place becomes more powerful and overbearing when the haunting of persons are ineffective and fall on deaf ears and blind eyes. When we don't learn our lessons, our places of abode, our rooms, our houses, our land, our nation, absorb the haunting, and they become sick and blighted, and eventually, in reasonable time, our places of abode become hostile. This, in turn, exacerbates our post-colonial trauma and national pain. We are haunted as a nation, and our ghosts exist as symbols of our trauma and our pain. But our ghosts are not there to harm us. They are there to open our eyes to what we have to face, to what we have to resolve, so that we can free ourselves from the haunting once and for all and not create any more new ghosts. The surface layer, the family story, is what we read on the page, unfolds on the page. Here we have all of the fun, wonderful details that situate our novel in the past. The fashion, the interior decor, the soirees, the human interactions, the food, the vehicles, the taboos and the trends, the preoccupations, the concerns of the people, not just pertaining to the period of time, but also pertaining to economic class and what they were concerned with during that period in time. This is research, and it is actually the most fun part for me. It was my favorite part because it was relatively easy, all things considered. I also had the added benefit or privilege, you might say, of having access to people, relatives and family friends who are still alive today and who lived in that time and actually lived that life and had held on to documentation. Some of those houses still exist as well. So I was able to really enjoy recreating all of the details, making things very visual, almost as if it were scenes in a movie unfolding before the eyes of the reader. Research is the fun part of writing a historical novel, and was fun for me when I was writing the novel, partly because UP also trained me on how to do proper research, how to analyze the credibility of every single source, how to follow leads, how to piece evidence together in order for it not just to make sense, but also to reveal facts that were previously hidden from me. The painful part for me was dealing with the layer underneath, which is the oppressive socioeconomic system and our post-colonial past and all of its connected sins committed by people navigating the oppressive system. And this is where the historical novel as a genre and as an art form comes in to become a gateway to the past. If we walk through that gateway to return to the past, we carry with us our contemporary knowledge and sensibility and insight. A historical novel, I believe, must be a critique of that historical time that is being shown in the novel. A historical novel cannot be just a slice of life of the past with no value added. A historical novel must be written through the lens of the present. I believe I, as a writer of a historical novel, should use my knowledge that I have gathered in the current time to critique that past, our wrong decisions, our wrong mindset, the sins we have committed. Writing a historical novel is a form of hindsight now, which, as they say, is the most effective form of wisdom. Everything that happened in the past can and must be analyzed, reprocessed according to what we know now, because I'm assuming that we know better now. We should know better now. not only must we not commit the sins of the past, we should also do our best to not commit any new sins in the present time that people of the future will end up criticizing us for. A gateway that helps people of the present to cross over to the past, such as in the world created by the historical novel, specifically the Maps of Camarines, is not meant to erase present insight. Crossing over to the past is meant to enhance our understanding of both the past and the present, the goal of which is to enhance our existence in the present time so that we can be just better human beings, a better nation. We can correct old wrongs, resolve old problems, provide justice that was not previously granted. We all say that we should not be living in the past, and for the most part, that saying is right. We shouldn't be living in the past, but we can only do that if the past no longer haunts us in the present. So, I'm not sure, but I think I'm running out of time. My 15 minutes are coming to an end. And in closing, let me just read an excerpt from the novel. This is from chapter 3, which is entitled Blood Ties. To anyone traveling through, unfamiliar with Camarines, the place was marked with what looked like large tracts of unused and seemingly unowned land. But according to the Maps of Camarines, every single speck of land has been legally owned for almost 200 years by only 3 families: the 𝗍𝗶𝘀𝗶𝗃, the Monsantillo, and the oldest of them all, the very first ones to step foot in Camarines, the Arguelles. On paper, no one else had rights to the yields and the legacies of the land of Camarines but these 3 families. If a genealogy tree of these 3 families would be drawn from the time Sebastian Arguelles and Marianita Enojado arrived in Camarines and began their bloodline, each family's tree would eventually grow into what would look like a raging baobab with tangled branches all over its trunk. Its Herculean roots would reach down towards the very bowels of the earth and then through to the lush under-terrain of Spain, from where it leached its ancestral traditions and its most essential qualities that kept it alive in Camarines. Its canopies would span many square kilometers of earth, its branches twisting and intertwining with each other. From that would further sprout even more twigs and shoots, and other branches that would snake up and out of the giant convoluted canopy of a genealogy that had practically lived and died and lived again continuously. Each mammoth baobab that stood for each family, although inextricably interconnected, nevertheless sustained itself only by the merit of one common and inescapable gene of doom. Surely of families this old and this enmeshed with each other, there should be an actual written genealogy. It should be maintained and constantly updated by commissioned scholars, hidden in a library somewhere in one of the houses of the 3 haciendas that controlled the lands of Camarines. But if such a genealogy existed, it has never been found, and the truth is that no such record of genealogy had ever existed, because these families believed that nothing in their lifeline would ever change throughout the centuries that would come, and if no changes to happen, no records were needed. What was is also what is, and shall continue eternally. They find their security in tradition and in preserving their lifeblood via the purity of their ancient hereditary alliances. They assumed that children would always know who their parents were, and great-grandparents would always hand down an arsenal of jewelry, old letters, old agreements, old maps, and old portraits that would be sufficient to connect the present generation to the very beginning of its bloodline. Such a characteristic, that of taking the past and the future for granted, was unique to the descendants of the 3 families. This shall prove to be the most powerful catalyst of their undoing. That was one of the portents that the Arguelles house moaned about in the night, in the dark and winding corridors, in the empty and dusty rooms that foreshadowed a future of decay and ruin. Aside from the house's knowledge of the abominations of the past, it also knew the house's future. Thank you.
Hello. Rinig ba? Okay. Sige. Ayun. Lang yung PowerPoint. Ayun. Yan yung pamagat ng presentation. So mas kasama akong co-editor nung anthology, tapos yung iba pang editor si Mendoza, nakasama ko sa Filipino department, tsaka si Kristine Ong Muslim. May previous kaming mga projects, tapos para mabuo to, yung ilang kasama din naming editor sa ulirat, tumulong din para mabuo yung lineup, kasi initially mas Pilipinas yung target naming maging tawag dito take-off point ng pag-imagine ng 2050 with regards to the impending ongoing na climate apocalypse, ganyan. So ayun, mas ganun. Tapos tulad ng pag-expand din ng ng book talk na to, nung pinag-expand din yung range mula Philippines tungong Southeast Asia, na naging challenging pero naging interesting at the very least para sa amin, yung naging output. So next slide please. So yan yung line up. Hindi ko na iisa-isahin, nasa table of contents naman siya, Tapos siguro yung yung bias ko dito, may graphic narratives na dalawa from i-highlight na rin natin si Julius Villanueva at saka si Chen, apelido ni Chen. Sorry, basta yung isang yung isang comics dito. Ayun, si Vincent Corpus, Last Days of Juan de la Cruz. So ayan, yan yung lineup. Sige, next slide please. Ito yung magiging outline. Sorry, mukhang lecture. pero ayun, lang naman, mabilis lang naman. Yan yung mangyayari. So yung introduction, tapos yun, in accordance din sa tema, yun nga, yung time yung susubukan natin i-conceptualize, Kasi interesting na venue yung narrative para i-explore yung mga tendencies at possibilities ng oras. So hindi ko na iisa-isahin din yan, nasa naman yan, nasa heading naman ng susunod na slides. So next slide. So ito, sumipi lang ako sa introduction, So ang pinaka-point lang naman, sa panahon ni Duterte, marami talagang pinatay, hindi namatay, kundi pinatay na environmental tsaka land defenders. Hanggang ngayon naman, under Marcos, contrary sa sinasabi ng journalist na nakalaya, hindi totoong na-lift yung fear sa mga journalists sa pagsusulat, ongoing pa rin yung one-sided na massacre sa environmental tsaka land defenders. Tapos doon sa libro, kung doon sa introduction, nabanggit din namin yung ilang scientific basis nung parang prediction or projection kung ano kayang pwedeng mangyari sa 2050, lalo yun nga, Southeast Asian region, at actually yung Global South, or mas proper tawaging Global Majority, kasi hindi naman magkapantay ng laki yung Global North at South, Yung global na majority, yung tinatamaan ng consequences ng climate apocalypse, mas huling tatamaan yung first world, na usually sila yung cause. Hindi pala usually, sila talaga yung cause, Sila yung nagpo-produce ng further makakasira sa environment. At syempre, kahit nung panahon pa ng may previous project si Kristine Ong Muslim, mas contributor ako doon. Nababanggit na rin doon na yun nga, tinitignan din tendency yan na maging anthropocentric nung nakasentro sa tao lang yung concern. Dapat lahat ng species involved may effect kasi, may consequences. Mabawasan ng bubuyog, good luck sa ating lahat. Parang napakaliit na component ng environment. So, may danger din na yung pagka-anthropocentric o nakasentro sa tao nung mga measures to mitigate climate change. So, ayan. Sige, next slide. Eto, sorry. Panahon ko to, 90s, no? So bakit nandyan yan? Kasi yun nga, yung panahon kasi, yun nga, may usapin siya ng kapangyarihan. Kung actually, hindi totoong hindi mo pwedeng baguhin yung nakaraan eh. Binabago ni Marcos, di ba? Kaya niyang hubugin yung reality, kung kaya niyang hubugin yung reality through bombardment of fake news and so on, no? Kaya niya rin baguhin yung history. At yun yung magiging factual, objective na history. So yung may control dun sa mga ilang temporal na period, pwede nilang baguhin sa kasalukuyan, pwede mo baguhin yung nakaraan. And on a positive note, syempre sa kasalukuyan, pwede mo ring baguhin yung potential na future na gustong mangyari ng mga kasalukuyang may hawak ng kapangyarihan, no? Kaya sinama ko tong Pearl Jam kasi yun nga, interesting yung mispronunciation ng vocalist ni Eddie Vedder. Kasi yung rinig ko talaga dyan ay everything has changed. Tapos nung ginugol ko, parang change, pero parang change. Pero parang nagme-make sense na na parang pareho silang nagme-make sense na lahat naman ay kabit-kabit. Yung change pwede siyang link, pwede siyang pang-lock, pang-secure, pwede rin siya syempre na kadena, no? At lahat merong ganoon. Imposibleng mailagay sa vacuum yung mga bagay-bagay. Tapos tulad nga nang nabanggit kanina, no? Yung past, hinohaunt niya yung present. Siguro isang madalas kong ina-example, yung pang-agriculture natin, kalabaw, nasa nakaraan pa yun, di ba? Pero nasa present siya sa kasalukuyan. Tapos, temporally, pag pumunta ka sa ibang bansa, feeling mo nasa future ka. Lumipat ka lang naman ng espasyo. Hindi naman iba yung year. Hindi naman iba yung taon sa Japan o kung saan mang first world country. Tapos, pag pumunta ka sa probinsya, feeling mo nasa 50s ka kung kailanman. No? Nasa ibang panahon ka kasi hindi underdeveloped, so magko-concentrate sa urban center. So, yung mga ganong ugnayan ng espasyo tsaka oras, pwede ring i-explore sa fiction kasi posible naman na posibleng magbasa ka ng work of fiction na set in the past ng first world pero feeling mo nangyayari pa lang sa Pilipinas kasi nahuhuli tayo. It has something to do with economics din kasi yung mga sirang bus nung ibang bansa sa atin ibabasura so pag bumalik yung taga ibang bansa dito, feeling nila ay yan yung public transpo namin nung 60s. Hindi naman 60s, siguro 80s, ganyan. So, sige, next slide. Ayan, may butterfly effect kasi sa sa oras at ito yung in-explore. Hindi ako pumili ng mga kwento kasi ang challenge nga bilang nag-anthologize. Baka binanggit ko na ngayon 2 comics, magbabanggit pa ako mga Pilipino, di ba parang baka lang So mas dinidiscuss ko yung paggamit ng time sa pagsusulat ng kwento. So syempre baka familiar naman na kayo sa butterfly effect na pinatutungkulan ko na rin kanina, Konting flap ng wings, it might cause a typhoon. Tapos yung grandfather paradox. Hypothetically speaking, on the record, hypothetical to. Kunyari, bumalik ka sa nakaraan, tapos pinatay mo si Marcos o si Duterte. Kunyari lang, ginawa mo yun. Paradoxical siya kasi pagbalik mo sa iniwan mong panahon, pag tinanong mo kung sino si Marcos, hindi nila kilala kung sinong pinatay mo kasi yung reason mo para bumalik ka sa nakaraan, hindi na nag-e-exist dun sa iniwan mong panahon. Nagme-make sense ba yun? Or baka mas madaling sabihin, yun nga, yung lolo mo, kunyari, galit ka sa lolo mo, tapos pinatay mo siya doon sa nakaraan. Pag bumalik ka, yung reason, yung dahilan kung paano ka nag-exist in the first place, namatay. So magdodomino. So may ganong mga paradox sa time travel stories, no? Magbago ka ng isang bagay, hindi mo alam yung consequence nun sa'yo eh. So paano kung yun nga, may pinatay kang masamang tao nung nakaraan, tapos may offspring pala siyang magliligtas sa buhay nung magiging tatay mo. Di ba? May something na hindi mo mape-predict din, yung pagbabago ng past, no? Tapos, yun din, ito rin yung ilang debate, syempre, yung time bilang river o ilog na nagfo-flow sa isang direksyon. Syempre, subject yan for exploration ng genre fiction, no? Anong mangyayari kapag isang direction lang ba, hindi ba pwedeng kontrahin o hindi ba pwedeng nagko-converge at nagda-diverge? At yung usual exploration sa possibility ng parallel universes, ganyan. So pwedeng yung time pwede, kaya nga 'di ba merong mga pagre-revise or may babaguhin ka lang na element, thought experiment, no? May babaguhin ka lang na element sa history, gagawin mong historical fiction. Tapos may interesting na consequences na ikaw rin bilang manunulat hindi mo ina-expect na may ganun palang pwedeng mangyari. Sige, next slide. Ito ay sinipi din namin sa introduction kasi yun nga, kung tayo ay hindi magsusulat tungkol sa future natin, may ibang magsusulat tungkol dyan. Kung hindi mo mai-imagine yung future ng Pilipinas, malamang may tawag dito, may magsusulat tungkol sa future ng Pilipinas na hindi nila nauunawaan yung sitwasyon ng Pilipinas. Kaya interesting din yung ilang pag-explore kahit ng Asia tungkol sa sa kinabukasan, no? Pag-explore na center ng na reliant sa mga Chinese, halimbawa yung nasa third book pa lang ako ng yung three-body problem. Hindi ko pa natapos yung pangatlo. Pero ang punto, yung mga Chinese na yun nga nagte-threaten sa US, Chinese na mga imperialista din, di ba? Na nagte-threaten sa US hegemony, na dun sa literary o dun sa cultural front, meron na rin silang pambato to the point na yung blurb sa book ni 𝗪𝗪, hindi ko alam kung red flag or hindi, na pinuri siya ni Barack Obama. Ano ba? Masaya ba tayo dapat doon o hindi? Na pinuri siya ni Obama, no? So, ito yung medyo baka kailangan ng paliwanag, yung nasa left side, yung anti-utopianism tsaka capitalist realism. So, ang dami niyang ism. Ang punto lang naman ng in a nutshell, kay Frederick Jameson, no? Yung anti-utopianism. Kasi may pagtingin sa utopia bilang ideal. Bakit ka pa ba't ka pa mangangarap ng ideal na mundo? Dapat maging practical lang tayo. Dapat yung capitalist realism, ang kaya lang nating maabot na yugto ng economic development ay kapitalismo kasi bumagsak yung sosyalismo. So kaya magkabangga yung anti-utopianism tsaka capitalist realism, mas ang nag-coin yan si Mark Fisher, kung gusto nyong mag-further reading, no? Limited kasi yung oras. Yung anti-utopianism, mas associated siya kay Frederick Jameson, no? So may ganong banggaan. Dapat kahit sa imagination, kaya nating imaginein na hindi na ganito yung mundo, no? Hanggang sa imagination ba naman talo pa tayo? Parang tayo pa rin yung kawawa. So yung utopia na idea, yun nga, gumagalaw siya in the sense na kapag may naabot kang certain progress, gumagalaw yung ideal na society para sa'yo. Kapag nakontento tayo na ganito na lang, wala na tayong ma-imagine na future, ang nai-imagine na natin ay same set of same na configuration, no? Tawag dito, may problema doon, malaking hamon iyon. Sesegue lang konting-konti sa saglit sa sarili kong libro, sorry. Tawag dito dun sa Oroboro, may Marcos pa rin, pero may Southern Philippines nandun pero yun yung hindi ko diniscuss, no? May Southern Philippines wherein nandun yung resistance movement. Magkasing pantay na sila magkapantay na sila ng kapangyarihan. Pero may Marcos pa rin. Kahit ako, personally, mahirap talaga imaginein na wala yung mga hayop na yan, di ba? Nawala sila. Pero nandyan nakabalik di ba? So, sige, next slide. May slide pa ba? Last na yata ito. Tama ba? Last slide na, no? Naano ako sa oras baka mag-overtime ako kaya nag-PowerPoint. So ito, kakahanap ko lang nito recently. Yung Palestine plus 100 stories from a century after the Nakba. No? So ngayon, may crisis tayo sa kasalukuyan, di ba? Malamang magkaiba yung future na nai-imagine ng Zionist imperialists, no? Sa ini-imagine lang future, nakatayo yung nila, yung state nila, nakatayo yung state nila habang burado na sa mukha ng mundo yung mga Palestino. Ngayon, kaya nga ito rin yung sinipi ko para naman medyo optimistic o kahit mahirap, no? Sa mga kwento, doon tayo pwedeng magsimula na kahit papaano, mai-imagine pa rin natin na merong mga Palestino 100 years after the Nakba, kasi 1948 ba yung Nakba? 1948 yata, tas 2048 yung setting ng mga kwento na nandito sa anthology na to. So at least may imagination na existing pa rin yung mga Palestino 100 years from now. Hindi magtatagumpay yung State of Israel na muli, magkaiba yung State of Israel sa mga Hudyo. May mga Hudyo na kontra sa Zionist aggression. No? So may ganong distinction na dapat existing pa rin tayo. Tapos yung Palestinian question sa kasalukuyan. Hindi pun lang pero medyo pun din. yung title na From the River to DC, Destination Sea 20 AD, kasi yun din yung slogan nung Palestinian resistance. Kasi kung hindi natin ma-imagine yung sarili natin na nandun pa rin tayo sa future, at kung magtagumpay yung pagbura ng isang lahi, pag nagtagumpay yung genocide with impunity sa war crimes, sinong next sa atin na kaya nilang gawan ng ganyan nang walang pumapalag, no? So, ganun yung pag-imagine ng future. Lagi siyang may basis sa present. At expression siya ng hope. Kasi itong anthology na to, expression ng hope na nandito pa rin, hindi nyo kami mabubura sa mukha ng daigdig in the future. Meron kaming kwento kung paano namin na-imagine yung sarili namin 100 years from now. Ngayon, back to the anthology, ganun din yung Destination Sea. Kasi, alam nga naman, source lang ng extraction ng resources ang Southeast Asia. May way para mabuhay pa rin tayo, pero yun nga, nakabase sa kung ano ba yung present, kung ano yung possible. Pero even what's possible, challenge siya na mangahas na mag-imagine ng something na impossible. No? Something na sasabihin ng dominant ideas na imposible. So actually, hindi ko nakikita kung nasan yung oras, pero I think yun muna. Okay lang. Okay na. Ayun, salamat.
Good afternoon. Thank you for this invitation. I haven't been here in a long while. Yung travel time ko lang dito is the fact that this book came out a long time ago, but was republished by Penguin in 2019. But I think it first came out, when was that, Jerry? 2008, 10? Yeah, a long time ago. But my first question is to everyone here in the audience, is anyone writing a book or thinking of writing a novel now? Yay! Isa lang? Out of this group? Or nahihiya lang? So, nahihiya lang. So yung presentation ko is not, I don't have a PowerPoint, I don't have a, what I want to talk about is the process. Okay? So what I'm going to do is just read first an excerpt, very short one page lang, and then I'll tell you how it all started. Okay? This is chapter 18 of part 2 of the book. Sa gitna na siya. So, when 𝗏𝗏 France returned to 𝗏𝗏, this story is about the uprising in Sulu in 1974. When 𝗏𝗏 France returned to 𝗏𝗏, she was not surprised to see 𝗏𝗏 back at her home, at her store. Sorry. You have to forgive me, may jet lag lang ako, wala pa akong tulog. So, let me start again. When 𝗏𝗏 France returned to 𝗏𝗏, she was not surprised to see 𝗏𝗏 back at her store. Not as surprised as the old, beady-eyed woman who saw her standing there, pale, her skin that used to shimmer like pearl, appearing drab. She was wearing a pair of rubber sandals, mud splashed at the back of her ankles. Her stomach was flat, and she was not carrying a baby in her arms, which 𝗏𝗏 might have expected at the very least, but she did not ask why. She knew what 𝗏𝗏 France came back for, so she told her, regretfully, he has not been back. And 𝗏𝗏 France said, it's okay, I'll wait. 𝗏𝗏 need not say more. 𝗏𝗏 France came back because 𝗏𝗏 was a world she did not want to leave, a world she made up to her liking. The salty blue sea and the purple sky were hers. The harsh yellow-orange sun had permeated her skin, penetrated her skin. The rainbow colors of a violent island had tied a ribbon around her heart. She had to belong somewhere. She had to choose, and she chose 𝗏𝗏. From the moment the MV Milagrosa docked, 𝗏𝗏 France felt she could not touch a thing, and anything she might touch could break, a fragile vapor. Nor could she smell the rubble, the sweat, the smoke, the leftover damages of a fire, the silent suffering. What she could hear were too many invisible birds singing. The crying mountain watched over despair, the aftermath of a siege gone wrong. The walled city of 𝗏𝗏 was a skeleton of blackened debris, but she would be able to find her way. She knew in her ribbon-tied heart that this is where she belonged. It gave her peace. A blanket was about to uncover the morning sun and the crying mountain, leaving the sky open to a blossoming purple like an amethyst offered by heaven. It was a beautiful hallucination, she thought, if that was how a world had to be recreated. God remained merciful. 𝗏𝗏 France inhaled the silence of a dew-misty morning. That much she could relish about something that was so familiar her skin tingled. The odor of 𝗏𝗏 welcomed her, salty fish and pungent corals and a faraway perfume of spices. So yun na muna. So what I think why I read that is because when I first wrote the book, this was the first chapter. And it ended up in the middle. And I don't even know how it happened. So I think the first message I really want to give is that everything has a process. It doesn't have to be just because you've made an outline or something, you have to follow that through. And in my case, I have to admit this, I didn't know what I was doing from the very start. Kasi nung sinusulat ko na to, what was that? You agree? Because when I started this, I was already out of the country. And what I really wanted to do, what I had in mind, was to recreate the uprising in 𝗏𝗏 in 1974. So I went to 𝗏𝗏, stayed there for 3-4 months, and it was my childhood place. I mean, I was there when I was little, before the uprising. So bumalik ako years later na, and stayed there, and hoping that I would talk to people who would remember what happened during the uprising, which was in 1974. And when I did this, it was in the 1990s. But when I got there, yung mga kakwento ko, ang gusto lang nilang ikwento yung love story nila. At saka nagkamali rin ako in the sense that the people who knew what was happening in the uprising have left. They've left the place, you know, the 𝗏𝗏 is gone. The 𝗏𝗏 that we knew is gone. So they left. They went to Manila, or they went to Zamboanga, or many of them even moved to the States. And it was only later on na mas na-recreate ko kung ano talaga yung nangyari. And even the person I was living with, I was staying in a house, his brother was one of the leaders of the MNLF. And even at that time, he didn't even want to tell me everything that was going on. Later na lang niya kumento sa akin kung ano talaga yung role ng brother niya. Kasi nagkaroon ng faction sa MNLF, and I guess he didn't want to discuss that. So, I didn't know how to start the book. And then I left the country, and I was missing Holo for some strange reason. So ang ginawa ko, instead of writing it as a non-fiction book, I started just writing images. Things that I remembered from my own upbringing there, people's stories, other people's stories. I have an aunt who was married to a Muslim, so what she went through, so I put that all in, and ang weird part is the plot came after. So, nung naging clear na yung plot, natapos ko na siya, kahit na binibigay ko na sa mga agents, publishers, wala pa rin gustong kumuha. So sabi ko, what? Maybe I'm really like doing something, weird. So, I set it aside. And then when I came back to the country, I said, okay, for one last time, really one last time, I'll just fix this, and then I'll put it in the drawer. And when I fixed it, this is how it came out to be. Pero ito, ibang draft na to. Sa Penguin edition, it's 10,000 more words. I added more words than the first one, sorry. Yeah. So I think what I want to say is that everything has its time, everything has its journey, and just go with it. And don't think that just because, no one's accepting your work or whatever, there's a reason for it, and you can just set it aside and work on it again, and it will just happen like that. So when I came back and when I said, okay, I'm just going to put this in the drawer, it's done, it's finished, somebody said, hey, there's a contest, there's a UP literary contest, why don't you put yours in? And I said, okay, how am I going to do this? So a friend just helped me do the line editing, and then I submitted it, and it won. But this was years ago. This was 2010. Was that? I think it was 2010 or 28. 28 because it was the 100-year anniversary of UP. And then 2 years later, UP Press published it, and then there was some controversy also over that. But I'm not going to talk about it because Jerry's here. And again, it's the same thing. There was another journey because the literary agent was trying to sell it abroad, but so many things were happening. And then finally, nabigay niya sa Penguin. So I think yun lang. I'd rather just say that, sometimes you don't know what you're doing, but it's okay. And the only thing also I want to say is that you don't have to be very, very strict when it comes to genres, especially now. There was a time when, I remember in one workshop, someone said, you can't give me this kind of work because there's no such thing. Kasi sabi ko, I was working on a transition. I didn't know whether, because I'm a journalist by training. So I also wanted to write fiction, but I didn't quite know how to go about it. So I was doing some experimental work, and I was told that I shouldn't be thinking of a transitional genre because there's no such thing. But now, today, everyone is playing with genres. Maybe not in the Philippines yet, but in Europe, meron na rin. But in Europe, they're mixing everything. Okay, they're mixing essay, even crime, romance in one book. I live in France, so one writer that I can think of is Michel Houellebecq. And recently, there was a woman who wrote a book about the Second World War. Kasi yung Second World War, yung mga collaborators, lalo na yung mga babae, after the war, they were all shaved. They were all, made to walk the streets. Yes, very, very, that's how women were vilified. Siya, and this year, she came out with a book just based on one photograph. And this is a very historical photograph taken by a very famous photographer named Robert 𝗍𝗂. Just based on that picture, she came out with a story, fiction of the woman, but she used the woman's name. She used the woman's name and the dates, the circumstances behind the war. So I think that's very bold. You know, it's really, really bold. Hindi ko pa alam yung mga reaction kasi kalalabas pa lang ng libro nung September. At saka hindi pa siya translated sa Tagalog, sa English. But I'm just saying that, you know, if you're still unsure, just do it. Just keep trying and just see how it's going to fit in. Because at some point, you will know how it's going to gel. And I remember a famous writer saying that he won't, the only way he feels that the book is okay, he equated it to, this is horrible, someone going to the bathroom and knowing that what you're doing is done. You know what I mean, right? So that kind of feeling, you know, yung feeling na, kasi lahat siya feeling siya, di ba? It's not all, like I said, if you have an outline, just, you feel free to break it and you don't have to follow every single little thing. Just go with your flow. Just go with what you feel. And if you like workshops, just join workshops. If you have mentors, you're very lucky if you have mentors. Because otherwise, that's when you will really take time, you know, finding your way around. So I think that's it. That's all I want to say. Kasi wala pa talaga akong tulog. So, yun lang. And if you have any questions after, it's okay.
Is this on? So thank you to all of our speakers. That was so fascinating. Personally, my mind is buzzing with all of these different ideas. If you guys have read these books or plan to read these books, you'll know that they're all so unique and distinct in their approaches. If we think about genre, as you were talking about earlier, all sorts of ways you can categorize these books as genre. But if we think about even time, it's like what you were saying, being a time stream in terms of only flowing one way. I feel like this discussion really reminds us that even if we accept time flowing in just one way, the only way we can really make sense of time, whether it's past, present, or future, is this kind of multi-perspective approach, right? Welcoming more and more voices to add to the discussion and have these new perspectives to make sense of this past, present, and future. Having said that, I suppose this is now the time to welcome your own voices to the discussion, and we now can open the floor to a Q&A. So do we have anyone from the audience who would like to ask a question? Tin, yes.
Thank you to all the panelists for your presentation. Personally, I feel very enriched by it, especially since I just came back from a conference where they were, in particular, talking about versions of the past, present, and future. And to my dismay, this was an international conference, somewhere in Europe, sa Austria. They were actually talking very comfortably about a version of time which was not linear, so alternative, but one wherein the past is the present and the present is the future. They were very comfortable talking about it because it is new, but at the same time, coming from the Philippines, would I really want to envision a future which is the same as the past and the present? And as Tilde was pointing out kanina, hindi naman ganun eh. May mga nagbabago. And malaking bagay sa pagbabago na yun, ang paraan natin ng pag-uusap tungkol sa realidad natin. And so, for me, hearing this, this variety of ways and approaches to time, for me was very enriching, full of hope. Para that anti-capitalist version of time. And even in terms of writers, we really, Jerry and I were talking about, we usually do start with images, and images are timeless in a way, right? And where you are, as Maryanne was saying earlier, where you are right now interacts with that version of the past, which seems timeless, and there is some message there that as writers, that's our job, to make that explicit. So, with that, no, yung parang una babatiin ko lang si Maryanne, congratulations, the novel was actually her PhD project, and she graduated, di ba? Ah, hindi pa. Okay, defense, she's defending. Ay, hindi, okay. So, nandyan na siya. Ayan, so, congratulations for coming out with the book already. That's also very, pero ito yung tanong ko. Yun, with that, no, na parang, there are versions, di ba, of time itself, the concept of time. Have you ever written about, considered, or read a work that communicated a concept, idea of time that is not imperialist, di ba? Not colonial in nature, because when we think about the linear way we conceive of time, in a sense, it's very oppressive, di ba? So I'm looking for work siguro or approaches to the concept of time that are not that, but at the same time, not one that will tell me that the past and the present and the future are all the same. Yun. Thank you. Yes, yung question ko, are there approaches that you might suggest to or authors that might have expressed a notion of time that is not imperialist in nature, or some strategies, di ba, in coming up with a conception of time that isn't plainly linear, ganon.
The question is just a little bit strange to me because most of the books I've been reading lately mixed yung, wala. So, hindi masyado nasa consciousness ko na linear lahat. Halos hindi na nga sila linear. Pati yung mga flashback devices nila, ang gagaling na. And I don't even know, you don't even recognize it until after. You know, like, where did she go? Where did it go? You know, but it was all very seamless without you being conscious of the fact that it was going back and forth. I think when it comes to reading materials, I'm out of the linear phase. Yeah.
That's a very interesting question because my framework for study in my MA Comparative Literature is spectrality. And spectrality is it's under the deconstructive method in which di ba, ang deconstruction is not really a breaking down of the work. It is the finding of the binary opposites and where the flip happens. You have to identify that where what seems like the dominant binary is actually not. And the non-dominant binary is actually the dominant binary or the foundation for the dominant binary. That is the deconstructive method. So if you go to spectrality as one of the specific ways in applying deconstruction, you have to find the point in which the haunted is not actually who is really the ghost here? It's not really the ghost. May mga ganong tema sa spectrality. And Derrida is one of the foundational proponents of spectrality. He defines it as the time being out of joint. So time is really, the element of time is really a major factor in seeing, in looking at certain work in order to find yung flip between the dominant and the non-dominant binary. So now that, because this is our topic, the past, the present, and the future, and the gateways and portals that we go through, I haven't read anything, any novel or any story that deals with time in a non-linear way. It's always like time is an arrow. However, the Europeans are more experimental with time. So I'm going to mention an actual Netflix series. It's called Dark. Like a young boy with his friends, tumakas lang with actually his brother and sister, tumakas lang sila one evening at the party, and then they went to the forest, and then nawala yung boy. And then they were looking for him. They could not find him. He went to the past. And then people in that neighborhood, like the mother, the relatives, the friends, found that portal. They kept going back to the past. And yung minention nga ni Tilde kanina, yung paradox, that paradox did not exist there because the point of that series is time is not an arrow. You can go back, you can mess with time, even mess with your ancestors. It will not affect your existence in the present because time is not an arrow. Yan lang ang nakita kong work that dealt with time in a non-linear way. Pero when it comes to the novel and the short story, wala pa ako. Maybe I need to update my reading list. Masyado kasi akong nakatutok sa aking final thesis defense. That's all. That's my obsession. I cannot live outside of that. Pero medyo mahaba na yung aking TBR after my thesis. So I really want to explore reading works that deal with time in a non-linear way because I think there's something to that. And may I just mention Mark Fisher? He's a theorist who studies music. Ontology naman yung kanyang framework, which is also rooted in deconstruction. He analyzes music, especially yung music from the past, na futuristic, like in the 80s, yung mga synthwave, synth pop. That was the 80s talking about the future. That was the 80s envisioning what the future should be, could be, and then now, yung tinatawag yung lost futures, the future that we envisioned but did not happen, that is haunting us, and that is the point of ontology. There is a gap between the future that we imagined and the future that we actually have. May mga hindi nangyari doon, and that space between that is where the haunting lies. That's Mark Fisher. Thank you.
Hello. Rinig ba? Rinig naman. Ayun, kay Mark Fisher, kasi yun nga, canceled yung future, hindi siya, canceled siya, hindi siya nangyari, pero may ganong pag-envision. Yung other book, yung nabanggit ko kanina, yun nga, yung capitalist realism, parang wala ka na maisip na alternative kasi, kumbaga, yung hanggang sa imagination, hindi nila hahayaang ma-imagine mo yung something beyond. Kaya nga yun yung yun yung naging problema. Ngayon mahirap yung tanong. Wala ko unang maisip pero baka nabasa na ng ilan or napanood kasi naging film na yung pag non-linear yung una kong naisip kanina ay ang film version niya ay Arrival, aka Story of Your Life ni Ted Chiang, no? So doon yung language, yung kung paano ka nagsusulat in a nutshell, yung mga heptapods yung mga aliens doon, no? Yung way ng pagsusulat nila, may splash ng ink na paganoon. So nung inaaral nung linguist ba or basta nung isang professional yung written language. Mas madali kasing unawain yung written language kaysa sa oral, nagsettle sila doon. So, non-linear yung combination nung kung paano tumatalsik-talsik yung ink. Pwede mo siya basahin sa anumang direksyon. So, yung ganong pagbabasa, yung ganong writing system na in a way naka-affect doon sa consciousness nung I think linguist, nalimutan ko kung anong specific na discipline. Nung linguist na nag-a-analyze nung written language ng mga heptapods. Kaya yung mga nangyayari na sa buhay niya, parang ine-expect niya, tas okay lang, parang ganun talaga. Parang so alam na niya, parang hindi na niya ma-distinguish. Yun nga, yung pagiging non-linear ng oras, hindi niya na ma-distinguish yung nakaraan. Alam niya halimbawa na hindi ko nasasabihin yung ilang detalye. Alam niya yung mga trahedya na mangyayari. Parang ganun. So, kumbaga puro spoiler na yung buhay niya. Ganyan. So para may ganoon. Tapos siguro mandadaya ako ng konti. Yung isang hinanap ko pa yung author kasi common yung kanyang title. May isang comics education yung title ni John Hankiewicz, no. So interesting yung laro niya sa image at text kasi meron kang image, seemingly may disjunct yung text sa image, pero pag nababasa mo, parang sa ibang page, nabasa mo na yun, yung education? Ayun. Parang sa ibang page, may memory ka nung ibang pahina. Kasi nga, yung disjunct na yun, kumo-connect sa ibang images, no? So, I think by design, no, yung comics bilang anyo, it begs questions about temporality talaga kasi sa comics, sa isang pahina, kita mo na yung lahat ng mangyayari. Tapos iisa-isahin mo siya, di ba? So, kumbaga, kaya pwede ring i-maximize na mga comics authors yung turn ng page kasi pwedeng dun ka magpasabog ng bomba o kung ano man, no? Kung ano mang surprise yung gusto mong ilagay dun. So, tapos yun nga, it merits na babalikan mo yung ilang details, tapos yun nga sa pahina yung past, present, future. Kunyari may iinom ng kape, nakita mo nang nainom niya yung kape sa lower right na panel, for example. Nakita mo na siya sa peripheral vision mo bago mo baybayin yung bawat pahina. So yun, by default, hindi ko alam kung pwedeng i-claim yun. By default, non-linear yung comics page kahit na magpo-proceed ka dun sa sequence na gustong sundan, gusto ng author na sundan mo. Ayun, sana nag-make sense.
Even though I'm just the moderator, I would just like to very quickly answer that because that's kind of what I study. So actually it's kind of big, if I'm going to be talking more specifically about time travel itself as SF iconography. And it's really interesting because the first time time travel as a concept and as an iconography appeared was of course in H.G. Wells' The Time Machine. And part of what influenced H.G. Wells to imagine the time machine is that he saw a stationary bike. And I think that's a really interesting place to start when we think about time as not necessarily not in that kind of linear oppressive sense, because on the stationary bike, you're not moving forward in that linear sense, but there's still movement, things are still happening, even though we're not progressing in that sense. And the way that he originally explained the concept of time travel in The Time Machine was talking about it as if we're moving no longer along the x-axis, but along the y-axis. He kind of called it the fourth dimension, even though time is not the fourth dimension in any meaningful Euclidean sense. But essentially, it's interesting to think about that. If we think about it in terms of the y-axis, that means the past and the future is always constantly accessible from that present moment once you have that kind of machine. And the way a lot of science fiction stories, which I can't give the title now, of course, because whenever you put someone on the spot, titles suddenly just dissolve in their mind. But one of the really interesting things I saw in a lot of science fiction stories that I was looking at for my own personal research is really running away with that concept of time has happened, but is happening, but is always happening. And really questioning what is lost when we kind of force that kind of linearity to it. One thing led to this, led to this, led to this. What don't we get to talk about when we impose that kind of order, and what kind of voices that get left out, and the kind of way that reinforces a lot of existing privileges and hegemonies in society. And I feel like that's why a lot of, in particular, marginalized sci-fi writers are kind of drawn to this genre, because suddenly a lot of the constraints of time, which is in many ways a reflection of the constraints of society and systems itself, kind of open itself up and free itself from that kind of confines of order and linearity. That is all. Thank you. Do we have any other questions, perhaps, from the audience? Yes.
Hello po. Tanong ko po siguro kasi Ayun, ayun. May mga serye o TV series actually na parang pinapakita na may iba't ibang versions ng time. Kung kayo'y pamilyar sa The Good Place na may ang concept ay ng time ay 𝗩𝗲𝗂𝗶𝗶𝗹 daw. Sa mga akda, posible ba to na parang magkaroon tayo ng sariling parang nagkakaroon ng sariling concept of time na parang mas shorter to sa isang oras natin or mas longer yung isang oras natin. Pero in a Filipino way. Parang, yun po yung tanong ko po. Salamat.
What's a Filipino way?
Ano po, sa kontekstong Pilipino po, parang ganun po. In a Philippine context po, or, ano po, parang, paano mapaglalaroan yung time po sa akda na parang ganun, may iba't ibang versions na, yun po. Na parang mas maikli yung isang oras sa akda na yun, or yung isang oras ay napakahaba.
It's not necessarily Filipino. Yeah. I think depende na sa story. Go ahead, please.
Hello. Ayan, rinig na. Parang mahirap yung hindi ko rin magets yung meaning nung Filipino way kasi ang mas naiisip ko syempre pag nasa ibang planeta ka 'di ba? Mag-iiba yung 'di ba kung mag-iiba yung gravity, mag-iiba yung iba pang physics related stuff. Ginano na lang, diniretso na lang na physics related stuff kasi di ko ma-explain, no. Physics related stuff ay magkakaroon ng effect kung gaano kahaba o kaikli yung sige alis na akong face. Okay, sige. Yung tawag dito, ayun, depende sa planeta. So mahirap yung pareho lang naman yung gravity kasi sa Pilipinas pati sa ibang bansa. So mas ganoon. Pero kung ang ibig mong sabihin ay yung yung sa tawag dito, lagi namang hindi naman lagi. Madalas namang ginagawa sa fiction yung sige, sorry, example ko yung sarili ko, ganyan. May isa akong story na nangyari lang siya in a minute or less, pero sobrang haba niya. So, at syempre ilang influence ito, I think kay Italo Calvino, 'di ba? May mga kwento siya na naghahabulan lang sila pero hindi pa sila naghahabulan. Nag-aabangan pa lang sila. Tapos i-explain or yung basta may hunter tsaka predator tapos nakatutok lang yung pana o something to that effect. Halos walang nangyayari dun. Pero yung pagiging at I think yung example kanina na litrato na lang siya snapshot lang siya ng still image siya. Pero mag-unfold yung narrative gamit yung photograph na yun.
Hello? Yung narrative. So yung example lang yun I'm not even saying it's the Filipino way. Sa kanya, it starts with the militia coming to get her, to arrest her. So, kakwento niya yung nangyayari, tapos biglang may flashback na siya kung ano yung background niya, paano siya lumaki, sino yung mga parents niya. Pero nagawa niya in such a way na nag-flow. Hindi masyadong abrupt yung present past. Kasi yung past niya, it also goes through segments, right? Hindi lang siya one part in the past, but different segments. But I think what I want to say is here in our country now, you shouldn't try not to think too much about time. Our problem is memory, right? People forget. So how can you write something that will make people remember? You know? We forget. I mean, look, as a journalist, nag-umpisa kami sa EDSA. Ngayon, nasashock ako na kalimutan na ng mga tao, iba na yung kwento sa EDSA. And that makes me very angry. Why do we forget? So our problem is memory. People don't remember. So when you write something, it would probably be better if you write something that will make people remember. The time thing, it's a trick. Trick. I'm being very flippant. Pero it's a literary trick. You can do that anytime, wherever you are, whatever subject you're dealing with. Kaya mo yan, kahit na Filipino or non-Filipino. Pero yung memory, importante yon. Sa atin, lalo na sa atin.
Hello. I was already having too much fun in my mind with this question, how to deal with time in a Filipino way. Pag sinabi kasing Filipino way and then there's time in the same sentence, I keep thinking about Filipino time. Our concept of time in the experience of daily life is so absurd. Meron nga akong kilala, sabihin na, magkita tayo after lunch. Okay. Tapos 11:30 pa lang papunta na siya. Galit na, late naman si ano. After lunch, di ba? Kumain akong 11:30 tapos na ako. For me, this is after lunch. Wala man lang parameters na standardized. For me, that is so absurd. Like, how can we even be efficient in our day-to-day life kung yun nga lang na superstructure na yun that would help keep us organized, hindi natin maintindihan. So, for me, that is so absurd. And we can use that. We can use that to portray a reality that is very Filipino. Wala pa akong nalalaman na ibang culture na ganyan ang perception of time. It is so, para siyang napaka-vague, na napaka-arbitrary, na may mga relo naman. Meron na nga tayong Philippine Standard Time na si Pinoy ang nag-umpisa niya na meron talagang PST. Kahit mag-search ko sa Google, nandun na talaga siya, Philippine Standard Time, PST, which is different from Pacific Time. Magkaiba talaga siya. Pero hanggang ngayon, yung concept natin ng time late pa rin. And then we blame the traffic. Pero yung traffic naman sa Manila lang naman yun nag-i-exist, yung ganun ka-extreme na traffic. Other places in the Philippines, wala kang ibang mabiblame if you're late except your own inefficiency. That characterizes daily Filipino life. So if you're trying to experiment with time in whatever you're writing, you can exploit that. Yung absurdity natin ng concept of time, not in the big way na mga gateway to the past. Hindi. Yung pang-araw-araw lang na pagkabuhay natin, yung kahit yun lang, ganun lang kasimple, that can already be an effective jump-off point for you in dealing with time in whatever you're writing. Thank you.
I agree with everything that's been said, but again, I just want to add something very quickly. There was a talk a couple of years ago, I think, for the Nebula Conference. I believe Victor Fernando Ocampo was on that panel, and it was really interesting talking about time in speculative fiction, because one of the things those writers are pointing out is that language very much shapes our sense of reality, and there are some languages that do not distinguish past, present, and future as we do in English and even in Filipino. And many writers who speak those languages ended up using that as a sort of like experimenting with how they can now tell these stories in English with that sensibility of time that they have from their mother tongue. I don't quite remember the details of that talk anymore. I'm also not quite sure how applicable that would be if we think about it from the Filipino sense, just in that we do kind of distinguish past, present, and future. But maybe that might help you find like an entry point to like begin further study into that as a technical aspect. That's something you're interested in. Do we have any other questions from the audience? Yes.
Hello po. I think that maybe the use of language itself could be used in writing about time in the Philippines, because specifically in Tagalog, our use of tenses is quite fluid with, for example, lumalayag, lalayag. It can be used in both present and future tense. But I think I want to ask, how do West European or writers specifically mitigate the rigidness of English in terms of tense, in terms of writing about time? When Ma'am specifically talked about how seamlessly they write flashbacks. I think that's one thing I want to ask about as someone who primarily writes in Tagalog. Yun lang po.
Hello. Okay, big confession. I cannot write in Tagalog. I can speak, I can talk colloquially, but I cannot write in Tagalog. If I write it, papakita ko sa kapatid ko, pinagtatawanan niya ako. So hindi na. Tapos, I grew up in Zamboanga, and Chabacano is the language. And you know, Chabacano means vulgar, right? There's no grammar. So, yung tenses ko, wala. It's out the door, out the window. I'm learning a new language now, which is French, and it has different tenses. And in the book that you read, you really, if you don't know all these tenses, you can get lost. But maybe because the idea that I'm a foreigner, it makes it easy for me somehow, paradoxically, understand it more. So ang feeling ko parang mas mabilis sa akin maintindihan kung nasaan siya kesa sa English kuminsan. Kasi sa English it's very specific, right? This is present, past. I mean, in French you have a lot of interior past. So sometimes you don't know where you are, but maybe the way it's written, it makes you go and flow into it. And tsaka magandang basahin. You know, kahit na nasa utak mo lang, binabasa mo, magandang basa. Maganda yung lengguwahe. And to me, the only advantage is that you trying to think, how would you say this in English? And you realize it's really different. And somebody translating a book, that means they're really a good translator if they do that. Because it's not that easy to translate it into English. Pero sa Tagalog, hindi ko alam kung paano ginagawa yung translation. Kung mahirap rin, Joy. Mahirap ba mag-translate? Mahirap? Okay. Kasi di ba yung mga tenses rin from English to Tagalog? Di ba? Oh, so siguro I would think it's the same way. Yeah. But it's really the craft. I think it's a talent of the writer too in how they do it. Na hindi mo na lang namamalaya na nasa ibang lugar ka na pala. You know, that the writer is deviating from the main story where it started. So it depends on the books that you read, I think. Yeah.
I think kasi when crafting a story, we get the feeling now we cannot get away from using time as a marker. Diba? Kaya nga, mayroong mga futuristic stories para lang maset kaagad yung time is, kunwari may news article or may news flash sa TV na ganito yung date na year 2345 na pala, mga ganon. Kind of that's kind of the easy way out. Pero as a writer kasi, we were trained na we have to set the story muna. So part na yon yung place and time, napaka-basic. May ganun tayong mindset as a writer. So we have the feeling that we cannot get away from using time as a marker. Pero, pwede naman kasi nga, you can even use time as a source, hindi na siya marker, source of conflict na siya. Kasi hindi na maintindihan kung ano ba talagang time na yon. And that's where your story revolves. Time is misunderstood. No one understands what time it is anymore. You can also experiment with that because this is now parang this is now a good time to experiment with the old tried and tested, yung mga nakasanayan na nating ways. Parang we've gotten kind of tired of that na, di ba? Parang nakakapagod na, pare-pareho na lang. And then it's so much fun to experiment. So when you're dealing with time and crafting your stories, magalit ka lang sa time. Gawin mo lang siyang nakakainis na factor. Try to start with that and see where it gets you. That would be a fun experiment when you're writing your stories. That's just a suggestion to you and also to me. Yung gawin mo talaga yung time na isa siyang nakakainis na parang hanggang sa dumating sa point na ayaw mo na lang malaman kung anong oras na talaga. Something like that.
Hello. Ayan. Parang hindi ko masagot yung sa tenses, medyo mahirap siya, so mandadaya ulit ako sa visuals, no. Sa visuals mas madaling laruin yung oras kasi kunyari hindi ka gagamit ng flashback or ng sepia tone or whatever dun sa panel, pero may character na mukhang either siya yung batang character or siya yung anak ng batang character o something to that effect. Syempre, kung paano mo madidistinguish, kung gusto mong maging aktibo yung role halimbawa ng reader, lalaruin mo yung ganong formula. Kasi 'di ba usually sa portrayal ng characters, usually palalakihin mo lang yung ulo, paliliitin mo yung katawan, pareho ng hairstyle. Most probably siya yung bata na yun, pero biglang may anak siya. No, so malalaro mo yung time sa ganoong mga devices. Pero yun nga, pwede kung itatranspose mo siya tungong prosa, pwede namang sa description. Kaso yun nga, may ibang magiging atake. Hindi ka gagamit ng time marker, gagamit ka ng description. Parang yun yung ilang naiisip kong pwedeng paglalaro dun sa konsepto ng oras. Yun muna siguro.
Thank you. Do we have any other questions from the audience? Yes.
Hello. Magandang hapon po. Ayun, napakaganda po ng talakayan. And siguro ang gusto ko lang ding itanong kasi magandang palaisipan yung nabanggit ni Sir Tilde na contingent ang time with space, na parang halimbawa nga punta ka ng ibang bansa, makita mo very very developed na, whereas punta ka sa kanayunan, napaka-atrasado na kumbaga kakabit pa rin siya nung hindi mo siya mahihiwalay dun sa umiiral na ekonomikong sistema na meron tayo. And also contingent siya with technology na parang usually we define na parang pag may science fiction, merong neologism dyan na parang bagong technology, parang yung sa The Apollo Centennial ni Guerrero Brillantes, merong helidisc na describe siya na nag-hover around na hinahanap yung mga rebels. Siguro parang ang nais kong itanong, siguro mas malawak yung kumbaga nabasa ninyo na nakita natin yung parang pinagmulan yung development ng Philippine science fiction, na parang paano natin nakikita, pinag-uusapan na rin natin yung hinaharap yung ating mga manunulat dito na nagsusulat ng ganong storya na parang may economic baggage para sa writer na i-imagine. Halimbawa, sa kanayunan nga, nag-aararo pa rin gamit yung kalabaw. Wala pa rin, may harvester ng palay, pero hindi katulad sa ibang bansa. May harvester na ng sibuyas o ng ibang mga halaman na kumbaga parang balakid din ito sa pag-imagine ng mga writers dito sa Pilipinas na kumbaga, ito lang yung alam natin, pero technologically, sa ibang bansa, possible na pala, nangyayari na. Na parang kumbaga,
meron ding inequality sa pagitan ng mga writers sa, yun nga, global majority sa South na nag-i-imagine na, hala, yung na-imagine ko, existing na pala kasi doon sa ibang lugar na isulat na yung ganitong klase ng technology. Parang siguro, palagay nyo, yun nga, yung sa usapin ng development at parang paano mabibridge yun? Sa tingin nyo ba yung makakaalpas or kayang makipagsabayan ng mga manunulat natin dito sa bansa in terms of imagining time whereas, yun nga, kaakibat siya nung technological development din ng economic development ng isang bansa. Ayun lamang.
Hello. Ayun. Tingin ko may gago akong sagot tsaka may totoo akong sagot. Ganyan. Kasi yun nga, yung frustrating, hindi ko na sabihin yung title pero pag nabasa nyo na baka if you know, parang ganun. Nakakainis yun nga, may mga pag-i-imagine na yun nga, high-tech na may nag-i-imagine na AI nung naghahalo yung past and future. Tapos may mga images ng robot na sorbetero, mga tikbalang na parang medyo annoying yung ganun. Kasi para maging Pilipino siya, gagawin mo siyang tikbalang na robot at merong mamang sorbetero na 'di ba napaka-tokenistic. At in the first place, yun nga, bakit mag-exist yung medyo justified naman dun sa conceit ng proyekto na may AI na nag-i-imagine ng yun, may memory, no? May memory ng nakaraan, tas naghahalo yung future at past. Pero parang too easy yung ganong pag-imagine ng technological advancement na gagawin mo lang mechanical ang tikbalang at kapre at mga folk creatures. Kukunin mo lang sa sa tawag dito sa ating yun nga sa repertoire natin ng mga folk creatures. Ngayon, ang challenge sa tingin ko para makapagsulat ng kasi yun nga may mga argument lalo dun sa isang hindi ko pa nasusulat pero ilang beses ko na lecture si yung work ni Jose Maria Espino no yung sa Orbit 21. May statement dun may kinote yung author doon kay Gary Olivar no. Parang sabi ni Gary Olivar, kaya hindi pa nagsa-science fiction yung mga Pilipino kasi mas busy sila kung anong kakainin. Yun nga, yung economic question, no? Kaya mas mahirap imaginein yung technological advancement sa Pilipinas kasi nga yung basic needs muna yung kailangan nating pag-isipan. Kaya hindi ko alam kung relatively mas marami tayong fantastic na literature kaysa science fiction. So yung challenge na binobweluhan ko no kailangan maunawaan sana nung gusto magsulat ng science fiction kung paano nagfa-function yung imperialism kasi sila yung pipigil sa advancement bakit nila hahayaang magkaroon ka ng ma-enjoy mo yung robot na tikbalang na gusto mong mangyari, di ba? Unless may kikitain sila doon. Pwede naman yun. Pwede naman nilang i-co-op na di ba mas alam siguro to ng ilan sa inyo. Hindi ako familiar sa terrain na to pero babanggitin ko na rin. Halimbawa sa K-pop, sa industry ng K-pop, maghihingi pa rin sila. Yun nga, yung ilang tinatanong ko sa ilang estudyante ko dito, no? Challenge ba yun sa hegemony ng US sa kultura? Syempre, ang easy na sagot dun, hindi. Kasi in terms of form, in terms of aesthetic, in terms of validation, mas magiging malaking pangalan ka pa rin ng Asian K-pop group kung ano man, no? Kapag may validation ka na ng West. So, may ganoong danger na for the sake of masabi na merong development, magsusulat ka ng sci-fi na yun nga, gumagamit ng folk imagery na Pilipino. Yun nga, kaya mahirap pag nagbabato ng term na Pilipino, medyo ang daming bubuksang problema niyan kasi yun nga, mahirap i-pin down. Hindi maipipin down, rather yung kung ano ba yung Filipino identity kahit galing ako sa Philippine Studies, no? Parang lagi siyang debate kung ano ba yung Pilipino na yan. So, ganun, tingin ko necessary maunawaan yung kung paano nagfa-function yung kung anong power relations no mas makapangyarihang mga actually bansa na korporasyon, no? Parang hindi naman na bansa yung namamayani, kundi yun nga yung kapitalismo on a global scale at syempre yung mga local na landlord at compradors or aka middlemen no mga imperialista dito sa Pilipinas. Pag walang grasp doon sa ganong dynamic, mahirap mag-imagine ng future. Magiging ano ka lang. Hindi naman masamang maging optimistic at hopeful, pero kailangan ng balanse nung yung pagmumula natin ay ito. Tapos biglang sa future tayo na yung lingua franca, Filipino. Parang imposible yon, di ba? Medyo nakakaasar yung... sa iba, pwedeng ano yon. Masaya siya, feel good siya. Okay, nagpipilipino na yung mga Pranses, feeling natin nagtagumpay tayo. Pero ano yon? Anong basis noon sa current na reality? Parang may ano doon, may kailangang pagbabalanse doon sa labis na optimismo na hindi lapat sa lupa. Tapos feeling mo sa future, ano na, first world na yung Pilipinas. That's crazy, no? So, yun muna siguro.
I would just like to add to what Tilde said about imperialism and multinational corporations controlling everything now. Kasi when we think about science fiction, may mga characteristics talaga siya that makes it science fiction. Dapat futuristic siya, heavy yung technology, and hindi lang yung technology that we're familiar with. We have to make it exaggeratedly unfamiliar na mga unheard of na mga nai-imagine natin. Pero, when we go to that world na increasingly futuristic na, pero kasi ako natutunan sa anthropology before the more modern nations are, the more they begin to look the same. So kung mag-i-envision ka ng futuristic na Pilipinas, magiging same na rin siya kasi imagination lang naman natin ito. Pwede nating ipantay sa mga futuristic nations of the world. Will it still be necessary to put Filipino-ness in there? Does it have to be a deliberate placing of Filipino-ness in there? Hindi pa ba sapat na we are writing from a Filipino mindset na Pilipino tayo? Na magsulat tayo ng science fiction na hindi deliberately naglalagay ng Filipino qualifiers? Is that still necessary? Yan ang hindi ko pa alam, hindi ko nasisettle. Baka pwedeng pag-isipan nyo na lang. Pag-isipan ko rin, sana pag-isipan nyo rin lang. Kasi we can keep imagining futures, pero sabi nga ni Tilde, meron naman mga trajectory ang future . And if we look at the reality of anthropological sciences, the more modern nations become, the more they look the same. Yung EDSA natin, ang daming kamukha. EDSA lang yan may mga, yung Makati natin, ang daming kamukha, ang daming nagkakapareho na yung itsura. Kultura na lang ang naiiba. And even culture is changing because of globalized nations. Yung exposure ng mga tao to other nations, nagiging cosmopolitan na. Culture is becoming a fusion. So we have to think about, kailangan ba talagang deliberately may Filipino-ness there? What will be Filipino in the future is no longer the Filipino that is today. We are a constantly evolving society. Tayo nga ngayon, hindi na tayo yung Filipino from the 1930s. We're not that anymore. So we have to think about that when we portray our nation and our people in stories. Pag-isipan natin. Thank you.
This is just going to be brief. There is a Filipino writer who writes science fiction. Kaya lang hindi ko pa nababasa yung libro niya. Ang pangalan ng title, The Fate of a Distant Past. His name is Renato Tranquilino, I think. So try to look for his books. Isa pa lang yata o dalawa. Siya enjoy siya gawin yon. Pero hindi ko alam yung story kaya hindi ko masyadong ma-expound kung paano niya ginawa yung future. Ang interesting point lang siguro rin pwedeng gawin is something more dystopian. So I'm just going to talk very briefly about yung recent book ko, which is very short, 114 pages lang. Sorry, hindi ito yung time niya is 2030. So Manila is sinking, and Visayas and Mindanao broke away. And it's much more advanced than Luzon. So, pero sa akin, ang concept is really more of us being a maritime country where today we allow the water to divide us, pero sa storya, it's the water that united them. So, yun lang muna naiisip ko. So, parang it's a future that actually should have been our past, right? It should have been our past. We should have been, cohesive before. We should have been one nation, but it's not. It's really the waters that were dividing us. So yung future, yun lang, sa librong yun, yung future natin, galing sa past.
I also just want to add to that very quickly because the question you raised was literally my dissertation a year ago. So I can say a lot about that. It's quite a complex issue. It's definitely all of the things the other speakers have talked about. It's imperialism, it's a lack of funding, it's a lack of investment in STEM, it's economics, it's capitalism, it's all of those things coming together. There's also a certain element of sci-fi, at least a lot of mainstream, typically Western formulations of sci-fi, as in many ways kind of acting out a lot of colonial impulses, the idea, imperialist impulses, the idea of like conquering distant planets and intervening and helping these alien life forms who can't save themselves. This is kind of what we think about when we think of sci-fi. And one of the questions that I wanted to raise in my dissertation is that essentially, if we want to imagine what Philippine sci-fi is, the answer to that question isn't as simple as switching out the captain of that imperialist ship with a Filipino, right? That's ultimately not the goal of Philippine sci-fi, and it shouldn't be the goal, right? Switching out a John Smith for a Juan de la Cruz isn't what Filipino sci-fi is or should be. And that ultimately what I kind of argue there is that our goals with sci-fi is vastly different than perhaps the goals of many of those sci-fi writers in the West, just as the goals of Chinese sci-fi is also vastly different. And that perhaps we don't need to be technologically advanced in that sense to write sci-fi if we kind of reframe our thinking of what sci-fi is and what purpose it serves in the context of our own literary traditions, right? Unfortunately, I think that has to be the last question for now. Oh, we can actually have okay, we can have 1 to 2 more questions. Other people from the audience would like to raise anything? I know. Any questions? Oh, there we go.
So, hello. Okay. So, good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon, and thank you for the lovely discussion. So, well, I'm not sure if we have time for 2 questions. Pero my first question that I want to ask is, Ms. Maryanne mentioned earlier that a gateway to the past is not meant to erase the insight of the present. So now my question, given with this quote, my question is, how are we able to marry our perspectives in the present time in writing historical fiction? Considering when we're writing, I'm assuming it's much easier to craft a story or write a story in contemporary times because we have experiences or we are lived in that in that time in comparison to like living in the past, or in comparison to like writing a story set in the Spanish period, the American period, World War II or post World War.
Your question, I think, is how do we use our insight and knowledge from the present time when we are crafting stories about the past? Parang ganon. How do we marry the past and the present? Yung ating kasing past is marked by the fact that those stories were told by the people who were constantly in power. So there were stories that were left untold. May mga part na lang ng oral history, but they were not documented kasi walang facility or capability to document those stories in the past by the people who know them. Siyempre naman, ang nangingibabaw kasing power in the past, like in the world of the maps of Camarines, it was wala ng colonizer noon eh. The Spanish were gone, the Americans were gone. These were remnants. The system that remained were remnants of that past. So may power pa rin yung colonizer in shaping the superstructure that existed in the late 50s. Pero ngayon, we know better now na yung class system that existed before, mali talaga siya, which is why the Comprehensive Agrarian Reform Program was created. Kasi the hacienda system created vastly yung economic divide na mas lumaki because of the hacienda system. And part of our way in correcting that mistake was to level out things in a way with that Comprehensive Agrarian Reform Program. However, hindi naman siya na-execute ng maayos kasi the people who were affected by that, who would lose their vast lands because of that, found a way to retain their land, pero legally, hindi siya, parang legally compliant siya. On paper, they're compliant with the Agrarian Reform Program. However, in reality, hindi. Pag-aari pa rin nila yung mga lupain na yun. That was not widely known before. Pero ngayon, we can already see the patterns of the past. We can already see the movements that these people made in the past that preserved their power here in the present. Parang meron na tayong, forgive me for using the word, but meron na tayong wokeness of how wrong that is. Kumbaga nga, ina-assume ko kasi na we know better now eh. So, using that knowledge, because we were able to analyze the patterns of the past and look at the movements from the past to the future, yung ability lang natin to connect the things together, that should be enough impetus for us to see what we have done wrong in the past and what needs to be corrected now. So that's what I mean when I say, when we look at the past, dala-dala pa rin natin yung insight and knowledge of the present. Hindi na siya pwedeng slice of life lang. Kasi kung magsusulat tayo ngayon about like the 1950s na parang slice of life lang siya, wala man lang value added, bakit pa tayo magsusulat ng bago? E di magbasa na lang tayo ng mga sinulat talaga nung time na yon. Authentic pa yung mindset, yung language, authentic pa kasi slice of life lang naman ang hahanapin. Ba't pa tayo magsusulat ng slice of life now? For me, that's my opinion. That's why I write historical novels, not for the slice of life, but because I'm assuming I know better now than what I knew like 10 years ago. I'm assuming that I am less stupid today than how I was before. Diba ganun naman talaga ang goal natin, not just as writers, but as human beings. As we go along, we should know better. So when we look back, there should be something more. We should always see something more than what the past people saw. So I hope I answered your question. Thank you.
Do we have time for one more question? Okay, we have time for just one more. Anyone from the audience? Yes.
Hello, good afternoon. This question is primarily this question is primarily addressed to Ms. Yabes. I read two of your novels, Sarena Story and Crying Mountain. Crying Mountain in its former version, published by the University of the Philippines Press. Since then, I've been passing it to friends as an introduction to the affect of the revolution of 1974, or the conflagration of what, or other terms that they have used for the 1974 event. My question is, if you were to write the story again in a different perspective, that you think is an alternative perspective that you think is equally important to listen to, but you weren't able to write it because of your positionality as a writer, as someone who have left Holo already for quite some time. What alternative perspective would it be, and what methods of research do you think would you undergo, aside from talking to aside from the things that you have access to? Because I remember one of the resources you used was a declassified document, right, by the army. That was very important, but I think there are more narratives hidden and unwritten. Yeah, I'm also from Sulu. This is why a very interesting topic to me.
A few years ago, I spoke to, I don't know if you know the Jajuris. Do you know them? So Dr. Jajuri's brother, younger brother, was one of the leaders in the MNLF. I think if I were to change the story again, I would do it from his point of view. How he became a leader, because actually one of the reasons that he got involved in it is that he was a government scholar, and he, I think, I can't remember now, he joined the ROTC, and so people like 𝗻𝗏 got him to be the leader. But during the uprising, something went wrong, so nobody followed him, or 𝗻𝗏, elbowed his way in to lead the entire uprising, or it was actually him who was running the show, but he was killed eventually. So if I were to change it, it would be from his point of view. And but he died. He died after that. He just had like a newborn baby nung nangyari yung uprising, and his wife doesn't like talking about it either. When I tried to talk to his wife, so si Dr. Jajuri lang talaga nagkwento sa akin. Pero tong part na to, nilagay ko na siya sa isang storya, sa ibang storya, kasi hindi ko na pwedeng maigawa to eh. And also the thing, when we were talking about evolution earlier, the reason I wrote about Sulu was not so much that I spent my childhood there, but because I remember it as being the happiest moment of my family. So nung namatay yung father ko, nawala na. I mean, parang ang feeling ko na-resolve na yung Sulu sa akin. So it also, when you write, it also has a lot to do with what you're going through, I think, personally. So which is why nung nalaman ko yung storya ng MNLF commander, si Jajuri, nilagay ko na lang siya sa ibang kwento. Yeah. Mas interested ako sa part na yung wife niya nagkaroon ng kapapanganak lang. Mas interested ako doon. Imagine a rebel, commander, leading the army, leading his army, rebel army, and then his wife had just given birth. I think that's really very, it's a shocking thing for me. I would have focused on that, I think, and what happened to his wife after, and why he was put aside, because he was the one running the show. 𝗻𝗏 wasn't really, the one at the forefront. So yun yung mga storya na hindi pa alam, na hindi pa lumalabas. Siguro mas gusto ko yun sana. Yeah. It's a nice story.
And I believe that brings us to the end of our Q&A. Before we formally close the program, we would like to welcome Miss 𝗩𝗲𝗀 to the stage from Penguin, just to talk a little bit about Penguin itself and the theme of our talk.
Hello everyone, my name is 𝗩𝗲𝗀 Manduriao from Penguin Random House Southeast Asia, and I would like to thank all of you here today for coming and joining this talk about time travel through stories. And I would also like to thank 𝗍𝗶𝗶𝗹, Sir Joey Bakiran, Sir Vlad, and of course 𝗍𝗶𝗃 for helping organize this event, and of course to Sydney for moderating the talk. I would also like to thank our esteemed authors, Ms. Yabes, Ms. Maryanne Moll, Tilde Acuña, for sharing their insights on how fiction becomes a gateway to the past, present, and future, and especially how their writings have given us a window to the past and a glimpse of the future. Whether that imagined future will indeed happen, that remains on how we presently respond to the lessons or to the memories, as Ms. Chris mentioned, of our history. While Penguin is still a young publishing house in Southeast Asia, we are privileged to have found such gems of local literature, whether classics or contemporary, fiction and non-fiction. Our books and catalogs aim to represent and celebrate the local voices, local stories, local histories, and local cultures. It is our endeavor to take our original literature to a wider readership, not just within Southeast Asia, but preferably across international reading communities. Events such as these help our books and authors to connect with readers, showcase these literary works, and make reading and literature more accessible. Once again, thank you for coming to this event, and I hope you enjoyed listening and conversing with our authors. Lastly, I'd also like to share that their books are available outside. Ayun lang po. Maraming salamat again. Thank you.
And with that, I would like to formally close the program. Again, thank you for joining us, whether you're online or in person. If you're here in person, I do hope you stay and check out the books that Ms. 𝗩𝗲𝗀 mentioned outside. You also have a wonderful opportunity to get these books signed by the authors themselves. And I hope to see you in future 𝗍𝗶𝗃 events. So thank you again and have a great day.